Hey, this is Mark Harvey, psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, sitting in my office at the clinic with a funny Zoom background that I don't know how to turn off. But anyway, emotions are the spice of life. Emotions add color to an otherwise gray and drab existence. So you got to have emotions. Now, the thing with borderline personality disorder is that you have very strong emotions, sometimes overwhelming emotions. So today's talk is going to be how to diagnose borderline personality disorder, what it actually means as a diagnosis. I'd like to turn off this screen, but I don't know how. Anyway, I'm going to share my screen. Share screen. Here we go. Boom. Screen 2. All right. So I got this cool Adobe background because borderline personality disorder is a very colorful emotion, strong emotions, and emotions are what make life interesting and worth living. So, all right. What is a personality disorder? Well, there's 3 clusters of personality disorders, cluster A, B, and C. Cluster A, and okay, there's a lot of debate about whether there's even a point to having this grouping, I guess. Clustering system has serious limitations and has not been consistently validated. So if you might need to know this for a test, however, and it's fun to throw around cluster A, cluster B, cluster C, and know what you're talking about. But anyway, paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal, that's how I pronounce it. Cluster A, odd or eccentric. Cluster B, antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. They're the dramatic, emotional, or erratic personality disorders. Cluster C is avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive. So that's the anxious or fearful cluster. Okay, personality disorders in general, according to the DSM-V, the essential features for a personality disorder is an impairment in self-concept and interpersonal relationships, inflexible traits causing impairment in personal and social situations, and pathological personality traits. Pathological personality traits included in this model are negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychoticism. So it supposedly needs to be distressing to the person. However, you can make the diagnosis even if the person is not distressed, but it's distressing other people. Okay, a personality disorder, this is all the personality disorders, is an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the expectations of the individual's culture, is pervasive and inflexible, meaning it happens in no matter what environment, at home, at school, at work, at church, is pervasive and inflexible, has an onset in adolescence or early adulthood. So it's their personality, their lifelong personality. It's stable over time. It doesn't become something different, and it leads to distress or impairment. This is according to the APA Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-V, which you should all have a copy of. And in order, my Zoom background's not letting me show it. I guess I got to get right on my face. In order to work in psychiatry or mental health, you got to know the DSM-V. That's the criteria for working in this field in the United States of America. The diagnosis of a personality disorder requires evaluation of long-term patterns of functioning. So you got to know, it's hard to diagnose a personality disorder if you just meet somebody for the first time and you don't have any history of their life story. Okay, so some of the criterion for personality disorders. Criterion A, an enduring pattern of inner experience and behavior that deviates markedly from the culture, manifested in two areas: cognition, affectivity, interpersonal functioning, or impulse control. So you only need two of those areas. Criterion B, inflexible and pervasive across a broad range of personal and social situations. Criterion C, leads to distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So it may not distress the person, but it leads to impairment in a bunch of important areas of functioning. And criterion D, early onset in adolescence or adulthood, early adulthood, stable, long duration, it doesn't go away, doesn't change. Criterion E, not a manifestation of another mental disorder, like maybe it's just bipolar or ADHD or something, not a personality trait or disorder. Criterion F, it's not a medical condition like a head trauma. So if you develop a personality disorder following a head trauma, technically you can't diagnose it as personality disorder. You just have to call it head trauma. Or substance abuse. So borderline personality disorder is a pattern of instability in, I wonder if I can zoom in, interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affects, and marked impulsivity. So this is borderline, instability in interpersonal relationships, and their self-image and their affect, so happy, sad, and marked impulsivity. Borderline personality disorder is characterized by instability in functioning, affect, mood, interpersonal relationships, and sometimes reality testing. BPD is associated with significant morbidity due to common comorbid conditions like dysthymia, major depression, psychoactive substance abuse, and psychotic disorders. 70 to 75% of people with BPD have a history of at least one act of self-harm, and it has about a 9% rate of completed suicides. Signs and symptoms begin in young adulthood or adolescence. Disturbances in experiencing oneself as unique, poor boundaries between self and others, poor emotion regulation. The boundaries is interesting because the classic example is somebody that loves you one day and then hates you another day, depending on what happened. Maybe you set a boundary or something, and now they hate you, or they love you immensely. And then emotion regulation, that love and hate affects their emotions dramatically, so it can go into suicidal depression from feeling euphoric. Inability to soothe themselves adequately. So the classic therapy, whoa, what did I do? I just unplugged my screen. The classic therapy, let me grab it here, for personality disorders is dialectical behavior therapy. Oh, my screen is not working. Marsha Linehan invented that. So dialectical behavior therapy teaches you to self-soothe so that you don't have excessive emotional reactions to stresses and frustrations. Maladaptive attempts at self-soothing result in self-harm, angry behavior, violent behavior maybe, suicide threats, an unstable sense of self with poor ability for self-direction and impaired ability to pursue meaningful short-term goals with satisfaction, marked instability in functioning, affect, mood, interpersonal relationships, and at times reality testing. Disturbances in empathy and intimacy, and then the impulsivity, risk-taking, and poor self-image. So the diagnosis, we've talked over and over. It's pervasive. Let's scroll down. Impulsivity can be things like spending or you know, dangerous sex practices, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. Impulsivity does not necessarily include suicide or self-mutilating behaviors, because that's a different one of the criteria, which is recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. So episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety the last few hours and rarely more than a few days. So one way that you help diagnose the difference between bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder is how fast the mood can switch. And the mood switches based on their environment. Whereas bipolar, the environment doesn't have much of an effect on whether they're depressed or manic. But borderline, if they get an argument with somebody, then they're going to be severely depressed. And if something good is going on in life, then they're going to be euphoric, back and forth with strong emotions that can change from minute to minute or hour to hour. And that's not what bipolar is like. Inappropriate intense anger, chronic feelings of emptiness. And that's what leads to the drug abuse often, because the classic addiction model is that drugs make you feel normal. So meth or nicotine, I only feel normal when I'm using this drug. And so the chronic feelings of emptiness lead to substance abuse. Sometimes paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. 75% of people with borderline meet criteria for mood disorders, especially major depression and bipolar 1. Nearly 75% meet criteria for anxiety disorder. 73% meet criteria for substance abuse or dependency. And about 40% meet criteria for PTSD. Okay, so borderline personality disorder is vilified among mental health professionals and nurses, and it should not be. We call people borderline like that's a cuss word or something, and that's inappropriate in my opinion. Manipulative behavior happens. Wait, do I have a patient?
They showed up because I wasn't able to leave a message, but they are getting back in their car, so.
Oh. Okay. Everybody, this is Jen. Say hi to my YouTube channel.
Hi, YouTube channel.
Okay. Anyway, back to the manipulative behavior. The impact of behavior on friends, family, and the nurse taking care of them can cause intense emotional reactions. When somebody becomes suicidal, for example, their emotional reaction is pretty severe. Marsha Linehan says that you should not assume that the borderline is trying to influence you by being suicidal. What they're doing is they're communicating intense pain, and those who engage in self-harm and suicidal behavior do so because it is an expression of intense pain. Self-harming or suicidal behavior may instead represent a method of mood regulation or an escape mechanism from situations that feel unbearable. So suicide is escape from pain, severe pain. Okay, so I hope you appreciate that a borderline person with borderline personality disorder is a very colorful person with strong emotions. And emotions are what make life interesting and worth living. So the fact that they experience it more strongly means that you can target therapies based on self-soothing and dialectical behavior therapy and teach them to manage the pain and the strength of the emotions, but also they should harness those emotions and pour them into things like art and music and poetry and writing, and people with borderline can have amazing creativity and experience life in a much more vibrant way than a lot of us borderline personality muggles. So, thank you for watching. I don't know how to stop this. End meeting. Oh, here we go.